video is an introduction to a series that we plan to do on preserving food. We preserve a lot of food here, and a number of people have asked us for advice on drying food, canning food, curing bacon, all those types of things. And a few of them have very kindly said, well, you guys should start a YouTube channel and put this advice out there for a wider audience. So here we are. Why do we preserve food? Well, a lot of people will say things like eat local, eat seasonal. And my response to that is seasonal. Really? It's February. I assume that the people who say that intend to eat no fruit at all in February. Because there's no such thing as seasonal fruit in February. Now, local, absolutely. We want some fruit? Here's some fruit. Dried apple rings. Absolutely delicious in porridge. We constitute it into an apple pie. Lots of uses for them. We have other fruit preserved in other ways in the freezer and so forth. So it's very local. We're talking food feet, not food miles. But seasonal? Questionable. So we produce preserved food for a number of reasons. Firstly, it saves money. In the summer, we can produce any amount of strawberries, raspberries, gooseberries, black currants, red currants, white currants, blueberries, rhubarb, apples, pears, plums. You get the idea. I can't produce them in winter. Well, preserving them so that I can enjoy them throughout the year, and Fiona can enjoy them throughout the year, is a logical way of doing it. So it saves money, it tastes great. We know what's in it. When I eat a chili con carne, specifically this chili con carne, there is no risk that there's horse meat, chemical additives, preservatives, flavour enhancers, or any other nonsense like that in my chili. Because I made it, I know what's in it. So I like that. I can control it, and I can control the dietary preference. How much chili goes into it? Which varieties of chili do I put in it? Do I want it with or without beans? I know a lot of Texans will tell you if it's got beans in it, it's not a chili. I don't care, but I want it the way I want it. So by preserving food that we make in ways that is convenient to us, we get food that's cheap, food that we know what's in it, we get food that we like. Yeah? We also get food that's convenient. People will demonise the ready meal. That's a ready meal. Pop the lid off this jar, pop it in a saucepan, and warm it through for 10 minutes while I make some rice, and I've got homemade chili and rice on the table, anytime I want it. So convenience is the fourth reason. And lastly, it does help us walk lightly upon the planet. We're talking food feet, we're not talking food miles. The food comes from our garden, from our chickens. Yes, we buy some ingredients in. We don't produce everything we'd like to, we're not there yet. But most of what we do can be preserved, and it's a sort of virtuous circle. It is convenient, it is delicious, it is available to us, cooked the way that we want it to do. It costs almost no money, and it helps the planet. Why wouldn't you want to preserve your own food? So, what is food preservation? We talked about why we do it. Let's talk a little bit about what we do. Well, in my mind, food preservation falls into two parts. One, you have to stop the food from spoiling, and almost in its nature, food will spoil. By spoil we mean break down. Food's made of organic matter. Organic matter decays and other organisms consume it, be they macroorganisms or microorganisms. I.e., it'll get eaten by a rat or rot through bacterial action. What we need to do is halt the activity of the microorganisms that break down the food. So that's part one. We need to stop the process of decay. And part two is we need to protect the food so that nothing begins that process again. Let me give you a very simple example. Here are apple, quite hard dried pieces of apple. So the action of removing water, which is a necessity of life, has stopped the microorganisms that would normally cause decay in the apple. Almost, we've mummified that apple. That's what mummification is. You allow something to dry out, and that prevents the normal process of decay. But what we've also done, in the example that I've shown you, is seal those dried apple pieces in an airtight jar. And what that does is prevents atmospheric moisture soaking into those apples. It prevents mould spores going on to the rehydrated apple and causing them to go mouldy. So there's two parts to the preservation. There is the immediate action of halting the process of decay, which we did in that case by drying. Then there is the process of ensuring that the environment that the preserved food stays in is sufficiently stable that the process of decay cannot restart. Okay, so we've talked about why we want to preserve food and why it's a good and admirable thing to do. We've talked about halting the process of decay and then protecting the food from that process restarting. What I want to talk about in this, the third part of this video, is what are the mechanisms we can use to halt the process of decay. And in fact, what these are going to look like are a list of topics that we will examine in more detail in real how-to videos on food preservation techniques. So each of the ways that we talk about that we can use to halt decay, we will illustrate and show how to use those round and about on a small holding to keep food for when you want it. Basically, to stop the process of decomposition and decay, you have two options, major options. One is you kill the microorganisms that cause decay. The second is that you put those microorganisms into a form of suspended animation. The only way I know how to do that is freeze. Freezing doesn't kill most microorganisms. What it does do is halt their activity. So the process of decay halts for as long as the food stuff is frozen. It will begin again if you let it defrost. So let's look more about how we actually affect the microorganisms themselves rather than just suspend them. We will talk about freezing, but let's look at the other one because there's more varieties, there's more things to consider in that one. So first up, probably the commonest and perhaps the oldest way of halting microbial action is heat. Why do we cook food? Animals don't cook food. I very much suspect that early man figured out that cooking food destroyed microorganisms that would otherwise make him sick. So, cooking food, if we get it hot, say 100 centigrade, that kills all microorganisms, right? No. No, it doesn't. Something very important now. I'm going to do a little bit of science. I'm not a scientist, I don't pretend to be intelligent, but this is important to understand on the topic of food preservation. There are microorganisms, there are things called spores, almost the way that microorganisms can reproduce, and then there are the outputs, the byproducts of microorganisms. You need to worry about all three of those. One of the nastiest forms of bacteria that causes sometimes fatal food poisoning in humans is a nasty little number called Clostridium botulinum. It causes botulism. Now, the Clostridium botulinum bacteria is killed by not even extreme heat. 72 centigrade there or thereabouts will kill it. So if you heat a wet meal, let's go back to our chilli. If we heat that chilli till it boils, it'll be around about 100 degrees Celsius. So Clostridium botulinum dead, yes? Yeah. No problem. The spores, which will, given time, become new bacteria, Clostridium botulinum spores cannot be killed at even 100 centigrade. So what happens if you boil that chilli is you kill all the live bacteria and then the spores turn into new bacteria. It's that simple. So you can heat sterilise it and you can heat kill the spores. But to do that, you have to get it above 100 centigrade, which you cannot do in a saucepan because it boils at 100 centigrade. You have to do it in a pressure cooker or a pressure canner. And we'll cover that in part of the video sequence. Another important thing to know about is that some of the outputs of botulinum are chemicals which themselves are not destroyed by heat. So if you allow that thing to exist for a period of time, it will produce toxins that no amount of cooking will remove. And those toxins can kill you. So what you have to do, and this is why I harped on earlier about it's important to keep things safe as well as initially stop the process of decay. If you superheat this, 120 centigrade, you'll kill all the botulism bacteria and all the spores. If you then seal it so no more can get in, you're fine. If you don't do that, but you seal it with some live spores in it, what will happen? The botulinum bacteria actually really likes being sealed up. It likes an anaerobic environment. It will then produce toxins that, however much you reheat that chilli, will not be destroyed. And they're nasty, paralysing toxins that eventually stop you being able to breathe. So, you can do it, but you've got to be careful. Alright, so heat works, but it's not as simple as boil something done. But we'll cover it in detail in a way that any of us can understand. What else can we do? Well, we can add things to a foodstuff that will kill off microorganisms. You might think, oh, what will you add? Salt? For years people have salted runner beans. Salt in a foodstuff at the right concentration will kill off any gnat bacteria. If you don't think salt is dangerous, go outside, find a little bit of grass you don't want, pour some salt on it, see what happens. The Romans, when they were conquering the world, would actually destroy a city and sow the ruins with salt, so nothing would grow there again. Salt is a very effective herbicide pesticide. It's also considered not particularly good for us these days, so I'm not saying we won't use those techniques, we will, but be careful with them. Speaking of things that are considered not particularly good for us, we all like this one, jams and jellies. Sugar is added to the fruit, and sugar is a preservative. That's why we used to use so much of it in time. It's not because we had a sweet tooth. It's lovely, but it's also, it keeps the fruit. And you'll also notice that this jelly is sealed up in a jar. Why? Because the sugar is inimical, it's the enemy of the bacteria that would break down the fruit, but mould spores love it. So if a mould spore gets in there, you'll get that bloom or white fuzzy stuff on top of your jam. We don't want that, so again, we use the sugar to stop the action of the microorganisms. We use the jar to keep out the mould spores. There's a lot of other things that will work. Alcohol, extremely good. People have preserved bodies in alcohol. You know, the Vatamanzi and all of that type of thing. Acid. You get something under about 4.5 pH and almost no microorganism will live. And we do a lot of that. The forms that we use, pickling is an obvious one. Simply the presence of the acid that preserves the food. And actually what you find when looking at different techniques is foods that are relatively high in acid don't require things like canning. They can be preserved in much simpler, lower tech ways. Alkali, interestingly, has the same effect, although we don't use it very often. I think we've found that the taste of acid is generally more pleasant than the taste of alkali. But there's a thing called lutefisk, which is a fish preserved in lye, which is a high alkalinity, which again prevents the activity of the microorganisms. There are other things. Saltpeter. It's added to bacon. It's part of a curing regime. Again, people think it's added because it keeps the bacon pink and stops it going grey, which it does, by the way. It's also known that saltpeter is highly effective at killing off botulism. So, a lot of things we can add to foods, and we will cover a lot of those. You know, we can also use heat. The third subset of rendering microorganisms ineffective is we can remove certain things. The commonest of those is we can remove the water. All life needs water. And if we dry something sufficiently, the microorganisms cannot operate. They will not break that down. And you can do that, it doesn't have to be vegetable material or fruit, you can do it with meat. Jerky, biltong, lots of other dried meats in lots of cultures around the world. And really well preserved jerky, someone once described it as you should be able to file it to a point and stab with it. It's that hard. Because so much water has been removed. But good jerky, even at room temperature, kept dry, will last for years. Other things you can remove are oxygen. That may sound odd, but think about a jar of sun-dried tomatoes. The oil that covers those tomatoes removes the oxygen from the foodstuff, and without oxygen again, life doesn't work very well. So the microorganisms do not cause decay. There are other things that work well with that. Fat, most microorganisms don't work particularly well on fats. So things like potted shrimp, there is a layer of fat over the top of the shrimp which excludes air and slows down rather than absolutely stops the spoiling of the shrimp. There are many more, but I wanted to give you a view of this is science, right? We're not talking about some little mumsy thing, you know, that we do because it's cute. Done properly, we can preserve our food, and it's delicious, it's cheap, it's healthy, it has low food miles, it's convenient. But we need to know what we do, and we need to cover the techniques necessary to do it in a number of videos. This is just a sort of almost a setting a scene type video. But if that's interesting, we're going to do a lot more on drying food, canning, pickling, jamming, all those other good techniques that I've mentioned. I hope that's interesting, and I hope it sets a tone of stuff that we are going to do that you might like to watch. If it has, and if it does, please hit the subscribe button down below, hit the notification icon, which is the little bell sign, and you'll hear about those new videos